Hi, everybody. Welcome to Proxyclick Connect. My name is Krystall Fierens-Lee. I'm the Chief People Experience Officer at Proxyclick. And this is a session where we're going to talk about how HR can bridge the future of work gap. I'm here with a great lineup of speakers for some interesting conversation. And the first thing I'm going to do is get them to introduce themselves. Jenny, if you don't mind kicking off.
Yes, very happy to. So very glad to be part of this discussion today. I'm Jenny. I'm one of the two founders and CEOs of Leapsome, which is a software for people enablement. So bridging things such as OKRs, 360 feedback, employee engagement, and company passion. And my personal passion is to make work more fulfilling. So perfect topic we're speaking here today.
Great. Brian, you're unmuted. Why don't you go next?
Sure. So my name is Brian Kropp. I'm the Chief of Research in Gartner's HR practice. And so what that means is that I oversee the research that we provide to the thousands of executives that we work with on issues like employee experience, attraction, retention, engagement, leadership development, all those sorts of things. And happy to be here as well.
Hi, everyone. Tim Gobran. I'm a Principal Director with Accenture as part of our strategy and consulting talent and organization practice, basically our people practice. I'm also the Commercial Director for our Organizational Analytics team and the interim global lead for that team. And lovely to be with you all.
Super. So this session, what we're going to talk about is the fact that as people leaders, we've faced a roller coaster at best, tectonic shifts, someone said, just to ensure business continuity. And we've had so many difficult decisions to make around work policies, technology, employment models, diversity, so many things. And what we're going to try and discuss today is a number of the trends and drivers of, let's call it the future of work and how that's affecting our world and the people that we work with. The first question, it's been said that we're on the brink of the second wave of disruption. We had a huge sort of disruption towards everyone going to remote last year, and now comes the next round of hybrid work, which is a blended model where some employees return to the workplace and some may continue to work from home. We're learning as we go, but many people would say flexible work is here to stay. Talent landscape has fundamentally shifted. Do you all agree with that? Or are we perhaps too premature in sort of making large grand statements about the future of work? I'm gonna let you decide who kicks off.
Yeah, I can start. Absolutely, we are. And yes, more disruptive than we've seen before. And this is why. So back in March of last year, when a lot of employees shifted to working remote, it was very even, that we all kind of shifted together and everyone went largely from working in an office to working from home. So the experience that everyone had was really similar and really consistent. Now we're going into a period where it's going to be really uneven and really inconsistent. So you're going to have some people that come into the office sometimes, on some days, other people who don't come into the office, some people come to the office full time. And that's just the location part of it. There's also the time dimension part of it, where what we've seen across the last year and a half is that some people work earlier in the day, some people work later in the day. Some people take a 3-hour break during the middle of the day to go play tennis or whatever. And so it's that unevenness which is going to make this much harder and more disruptive. And the shifting of who makes decisions, do managers, do employees, what tasks do we need to be in the office for? How does our real estate footprint change? It is going to take a couple of years, in all honesty, to work through all of that variability and all of that change. But here's the reason why it's going to last. One, employees that work a hybrid approach to work, all of the data shows they're just as productive, if not more so, that they're less likely to quit, and that you can attract more people to your organization if you offer that. And then from an employer perspective, it's cheaper. You can dramatically decrease the cost of your real estate footprint by up to about 30% per employee at the extreme by adopting a more remote architecture. So things that make employees more productive and save costs are likely to stay over the long haul. But it's going to be a messy, probably 2 years to get from where we are today to a fully functioning, well-oiled hybrid operating machine. And we're going to have to be able to work through that, because the last thing we want is during a period of messiness and uncertainty from here to there. And this is going to happen in some cases where some leaders say, it's too hard, it's too difficult, too much effort. Everybody come back to the workplace. That is going to be the thing we're going to have to resist, because there's going to be times when, frankly, it's going to be a bit of a train wreck in terms of how we're working this out and making it work. But in the long haul, it is a much better place to be from a retention, productivity, attraction, and cost perspective to be in that hybrid world.
Tim, Jenny.
Yeah, good.
Tim, go ahead, please.
Jenny. Yeah, sure. I'm totally agree with Brian, and we just did an Accenture Future of Work study, just got released last week actually, and we sent it out to 9,000 employees and organizations in 11 countries, 12 industries, and one of the key findings is that 83% of people surveyed preferred working in a hybrid model, right? And not only that, we actually found that those who actually experienced hybrid during this pandemic period actually had better mental health, stronger work relationships. They were better off working for their organizations than their fully remote or fully on-site peers. And they also had less burnout than those groups as well. And so, I think it is here to stay. I do also think it's a spectrum, right? We've seen everything from, hey, we're going to be fully remote as an organization, right, to kind of work from home forever, right, all the way to fully on site and everything in between. And I think it really depends on the industry. I think it depends on the culture of each organization and how they want to shift that culture over time. I think we're shifting and seeing a move to more employee empowerment and an employee-centric view. I think Apple's a really good example of that most recently, where they shifted to 3 days on site, and they kind of selected the days that people are going to be on site across all of Apple, top-down mandate, and there was, effectively the equivalent of a riot, from the employee base, and rightly so, because they felt their voices were unheard and actively ignored, and not really reflecting what the experience of the last 15 months had been to be, operating productively in this, pandemic environment, operating remotely, operating hybrid where necessary. Jenny, over to you.
Yeah, I think the two of you already summarized it all really beautifully, and just not to repeat anything that's already been said, and just maybe to build on that. I think also for us internally and also for the customers we work with, what we've really seen is that it generates an entire. It's definitely here to stay. We also are just, I can't talk too much about it yet. We've already defined, but we're actually communicating it tomorrow, what our hybrid model will look like, and what we've learned over the course of the past 16 months. And I think the interesting point also for me as one of the founders of Leapsome is the complexity it generates in terms of maintaining culture, keep on building culture. How do we maintain the same level of transparency we had before? How do we go about further building and maintaining psychological safety, which is somewhat easier if you're in one space on a somewhat regular basis. So the complexity of the expectations for leaders, managers, but also the people function rise significantly with that. And I think some of the topics we've discussed when we defined our internal policy is basically punchline what Tim and Brian said. We want to do it. It's aligned with our values anyways, but we would also have to do it for the sakes of attracting and retaining talent, and then bridging that with being intentional about achieving the transparency that we have and want to maintain, building the psychological safety that we think is one of the drivers of our company's success, and also thinking about what do we need to do then to actually go about sort of supporting and enabling our employees to stay sane, sustainable, healthy, training people how to work in this just completely different way. So I think there's that whole side that we're probably going to dive into right now that I think is a really, really interesting topic that follows from that.
I'm going to stay with you, Jenny, on that point, because I think of the group here. Indeed, as a co-founder running a business, you're really in the weeds kind of thinking this through. And I'm guessing, given what I know about Leapsome, that probably psychological safety, engagement, enablement has always been kind of part of the proposition. But how has the people role, the HR role, whatever you want to call it today, sort of changed as a result of the past, 18 months?
Mm-hmm. I think think everything that holds true about good company culture and good leadership is already like will remain in effect. But we need to be a lot more intentional, a lot more cautious, and it's pretty much the same, but at the next level. So more of being good at building transparency, like over communicating, but also obviously having the right level of pull and push information, which basically caters to a workforce that might be hybrid, right? So like just, some flow of chat at the coffee machine is just not happening. So we don't want to have people that are maybe not in the office as much miss out on some of those aspects, right? So being much more intentional about transparency, about sort of like proper means of communication for a hybrid workforce is something that we are basically that probably we have become a lot more intentional about, and that we need to continue tweaking and iterating. And I think the big one for me is sort of like, how do we maintain the level of psychological safety? Because ultimately, I think one of our drivers of our success is very strong sort of learning culture that enables learning at the individual, the team, but also the organizational level. Like one of our core values is challenge the status quo and listen and learn. And I think the kind of conversations you have on Zoom are just maybe slightly different from the ones you have in the office. So that basis, that foundation for having a good personal relation, like really connectedness in a team, that's a good sort of basis for psychological safety, for conflict resolution. Like we need to be much more resourceful and creative on how we develop that in a remote or in a hybrid setup. So we're thinking actually about could we have like an offsite with the entire company, like towards the second half of the year. We probably will go for certain guidelines on what would be a good time to be possibly in the office to then actually have a basis for that. But sort of like being intentional about that and asking yourself these questions, and even defining for yourself as the company, what's the purpose of an office, which has completely changed from like a place of just sort of like being in the office most of the week to maybe a place that's a basis for creating connectedness, for like symbolizing our culture and actually generating pull factor for people to really want to come to the office at times. I think this is sort of the very practical questions we go into. And I think that's just a new conversation and an additional level of complexity and demand on the people's function and every single sort of like manager and leader.
I'm going to come back to that kind of notion around space and purpose. But before I do, I'm just wondering, Tim, Brian, if you wanted to add anything to, zooming out a little bit, the role of the people leader in light of the pandemic, in light of all these sort of questions that have always been meaningful, but have kind of taken on an acuteness, if there's sort of been discoveries or insights about what it means to be a people leader today.
Yeah, I want to go back and underline a word that Jenny used a couple of times, which I think is an incredibly important word, which is intentional. In retrospect, one of the things that we've learned is when we were in an in-person world, we were allowed to be kind of lazy about some things we did because people were there. We could just say things when we remembered to say them. We could just be like, oh, we need to get people together. Oh, good, we're all here. Let's just pull everybody together. So we could, in retrospect and in comparison, be kind of lazy in all honesty. One of the biggest shifts from a management perspective is this intentional part of it. Ironically, in order for flexibility to work, we have to become dramatically more intentional about what we're doing. And that is intentional about when we're communicating with people, intentional about what are the tasks that you need to be in the office for, intentional about what is, and Jenny alluded to this, what is the purpose of the office. But the thing that I can't stress, if you don't have an intentional strategy about how you're going to make hybrid work and you think it's just going to work, it's going to be a mess because employees will think, well, I need to come in for this task, and managers think, well, they need to come in for that task, and it's going to be confusion. If you are not super clear about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the new philosophies are, not the policies, but what are the philosophies, the beliefs that you're going to run against in this hybrid world, it's going to be incredibly messy. And if you're having a leadership offsite meeting, I can't stress strongly enough, coming out of that leadership offsite meeting that you've got coming up, you need to come out with your new 10 commandments of the hybrid world. Your Bill of Rights about the hybrid world, whatever frame you want to use around it. But what are those philosophical guideposts that you're going to put out there to the organization, not to tell employees what to do, but to create that light, that destination point, that vision of how they should then work and make decisions and operate. Because if you're not providing that guidance, like I said, that Bill of Rights, that 10 commandments, call it what you will, it's going to be incredibly difficult for your employees to operate. And if you do provide it, then they're going to know what is the framework within which they should be making decisions and working. And that is so critical for every leadership team to be building right now. And if you're not, you're going to have a really messy workplace reopening movement to hybrid experience.
Can I stay with you a little bit on this? I love what you just said about policy versus philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it's and open to the group as well, because, and indeed, I think the clarity that can come with the policy, but the need to have the philosophy around why you're doing that, it makes sense, but also can be in some ways confusing as we're figuring that out. So I'm wondering if you could maybe for the audience sort of make a distinction between the two and what serves what, and then I again would be interested in the group.
Yeah, for sure. So when you think about policies, those are rules like people have to be in the office from 9 to 5, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but can be flexible Thursday, Friday. Right? That's a policy, and that you're setting up and structuring for everyone. Where it's problematic in this hybrid world is, but what I'm doing on Tuesday is individual work by myself where I literally don't have to talk to anyone else. Why do I have to go into the office that day just to bang away at a keyboard in a different location than where I've been for the last 16 months and been doing a great job? That policy doesn't make any sense. A philosophy, which is you should come into the office when the work that you're doing interacts and is dependent upon in-person interactions with other people, is a philosophy that helps guide employees. So that employees can say, well, is the work that I'm doing today dependent upon interacting with other people? If so, then I should go, and if not, then I can stay home. So that's the difference. Like another example of a philosophy is who decides what flexibility looks like? Do managers put out the framework and employees respond? Or do employees decide what makes the most sense for them and managers have to respond? Either approach can work, but that's a philosophical statement that you want to get to. Because ironically, having a set of policies about your flexibility puts us back 10 years where it was seen as a privilege, a special situation where you had to get special approval from HR to make it happen. And those policies are inherently inflexible. So that's why you need philosophies to help employees make decisions and managers make decisions. Because one of the other things that we know is we're going into a period where there's no playbook. We don't have experience. We haven't worked through these problems 100 times before to know how to work through them. And if you've worked through something 100 times before, you know exactly, you've got like the decision tree perfectly mapped out, then a policy is probably fine, but that's not where we are. And so if we try to policy our way out of this, we're going to create a lot of inefficiency and a lot of frustration amongst our employees.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, the call for clarity is huge from people, which can sometimes make people think that they want the policy. Sorry, right. Tim, please over to you.
Yeah, I think this, I totally agree with Brian. I think this pandemic really created a forcing function for us to rethink our attitudes towards work, right? And it's forced us to challenge traditional notions, right? That employees could only be productive if they're on site, right? So to this idea of philosophies, I think that one of the old philosophies was that optics were all important, right? In the sense that, out of sight, out of mind, right? So if I am physically present and with my colleagues, I'm going to get that sort of preferential treatment versus if I'm, off-site, remote, I'm not visible. I'm not, and that whole mentality has changed, right? And it's also forced leaders and us as leaders to really trust our people, right? And have in a very different way, right? Because that work is not visible to us. People are not visible to us. And I think that's a really good thing. I think that's a really good shift, that we're, seeing in the marketplace. Again, I think we're getting to that world of a highly personalized experience, right? That people want to have at work. And it's that blend of how can I bring work and life together in a very seamless way, And it's something that's going to meet my specific needs, right? So I think that movement, that shift, and really our role as leaders now is to create those conditions where people can thrive, right? Mentally, emotionally, physically. And it's always been the case, but I think now it's just dramatically increased, right? To the point where, you have to think about, well, how am I going to do a hybrid meeting? How am I going to resolve conflict? From a HR practices perspective, what about performance management, right? I'm not just going to reward the people that, I can see, right? I've got to reward the people who are being, fundamentally effective, right? And getting the job done. And that also opens the door now to inclusive talent, right? To wider talent pools that we haven't really engaged with in the past, really in the right ways. I'm thinking about people with disabilities. I'm thinking about neurodiverse talent, autistic talent, for example. How can we tap into those pools that have always been there, always been effective? Historically very underemployed, right, in the marketplace, but have all the right skills. The pandemic showed, hey, they can thrive in a remote work environment, right? And it fits the needs, their personal needs, and it fits the needs of organizations. Let's go, right? Let's go after that talent.
Tim is right when it comes to the data, that all of the data shows that what he just said is totally true. But there's a caution that I want to put out there, which is some leaders have seen that data and seen it, and their own experiences reinforce that and want to manage and work that way. However, as we've been collecting data and doing a lot of analysis, about 60% of managers, even though the data tells them employees who work hybrid remote are more productive, more engaged, all those good things, they don't believe it. And when we've done a lot of conjoint analysis, a lot of other statistical techniques, what we find is that even for the same level of performance, the majority of managers will give the in-office employee a bigger raise, a bigger bonus, more likely to promote them, even though their performance levels and contribution and impact is the exact same. So while Tim is totally right that that's the direction where the smartest, most progressive leaders and managers are moving, there's still a huge percentage of managers at a lot of companies that still have a mindset which is out of sight, out of mind. And as the shift is occurring, managing and working with those managers to make them understand this, appreciate it, be aware of it, test against those sorts of things is incredibly important. And here's one other reason why, which is when you look at who is likely to adopt different working patterns, one of the things that we consistently see from the data is that men are more likely to come to the office and women are more likely to work from home. Now, part of that is women are smarter and they want to be safer, and that's a safer decision. Part of it, unfairly, is that women in our society have a greater responsibility for childcare. And again, that's unfair and wrong, but that is the reality that we're facing. So you put that together, women are more likely to work more from home relative to men, and men are more likely to work from the workplace than women. All of the data suggests that's true. Putting that together with a bias that managers have for in-office employees, which is a bias and is wrong and inaccurate and not based on data. If we're not careful, we're going to run into this situation in a hybrid world where the gender wage gap that exists, we can debate how big it is, but it exists, will get worse. And the diversity of our leadership teams will get worse if we're not really thoughtful about managing that experience. Because all of the evidence says this is the right answer. All of the bias says a lot of managers aren't going to go that way. We just need to be really, really thoughtful about that part of it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think that caution is correct, because, what got you here won't get you there, right? And I think, and the word mindset is spot on. I think these are old mindsets, right, that we're bringing to the table in a dramatically shifted environment, right? And that to me is the nature of the work that has to be done, right? That's how we have to transform leaders, right, to become inclusive leaders. And it's not just about the most progressive organizations, right? But this is about how do we make this the mainstream, right? How do we make this the 80%, right, of the way that people work, the way that leaders work fundamentally. I think that's the real work of the future of work.
Thanks for raising this point, both of you, because I think sometimes when we are talking about remote hybrid, we depending on where we're standing on this argument, of course, it can feel full of opportunity, but indeed there are risks attached. And that was one of the questions that we wanted to talk about, was what's the darker side of a potentially more hybrid approach to work, which I think from a diversity and inclusion, there's some risk that indeed the fact that there are bias that have been there forever are still going to show their heads regardless of the situation environment that we're in. I'm curious, Jenny, can you think of other risks, or do you want to comment on the risks that's highlighted already that are sort of from the darker side of what hybrid could look like?
I mean, I think maybe just quickly on the point that was now pretty much raised by Brian and Tim, I think it actually links us straight back to the theme of intentionality, right? So we need to be incredibly intentional about how we enable individual contributors, but also like managers and leaders, because people never actually, a lot of like our leadership and managers never actually learned how to lead in this sort of like new environment. So doing the trainings on sort of like the unconscious biases that were sort of like explained here is the new complexity of the HR function and the leadership training programs. So just being very intentional of training that, and also giving leaders a tool stack on how to effectively lead in that environment, like understanding, I think something we also all learned in the past year, understanding what's actually going on at your employees, in your employees' lives, like how's energy level, like what else is keeping people from being sort of productive, happy, successful in their roles, like checking in with people, being really diligent about good one-on-one meetings, asking questions that maybe just go beyond like work outcomes into, I mean, a question I really regularly like to ask is what currently gives you energy, what takes energy. So like having that, getting that full picture and really training people that way, and also training individuals. And that maybe leads to your question, what's the second risk? I think mental health challenges with making it harder maybe to have a boundary and a conscious break between work and life, or work and the other aspects of your life. And I think that also can be linked directly about how do we think about training people, like giving people tips, tools, hacks to help set boundaries, to plan days successfully, to learn good practices about resilience, about mindfulness, about mental health. Like we also introduced mental health programs recently, as I think did a lot of other companies. I mean, it was important before the pandemic, but I think has just becomes even more important as sort of like there's a bit of more fluid between work and other aspects. So I think that aspect of intentionality, both in training leaders, but also having the mental health of your workforce very much as a top priority. I think that's the other aspect, and the big risk maybe I also would see in a hybrid environment also going forward post-pandemic.
It's interesting because, you know, we had asked before about how has the role of HR changed, and in some ways it hasn't changed at all, because all these things were of relevance to that community before. But on the other hand, in some ways it's changed a lot in terms of the duty of care has gone deeper into private life, and there's a newer level of acuteness. So it's kind of always fun in my mind to go, did it change or didn't it change? I don't think it changed, but maybe how it's being asked to do it is so much more intense. I want to shift us a little bit because we've highlighted, I think, some risks. We've talked about intentionality a lot. Can we be a bit practical? So, you know, presumably there's people, leaders listening to us. What do we do? So what can we do to help meet employees' growing mental health and emotional health needs, practically speaking?
You know, one of the, there's kind of a couple thoughts within there. One is we have to be careful about thinking about our workforce as a whole. As we've been analyzing this, what we've seen is that there's a lot of employees who have had a negative mental health impact across the last 14 months. And we have to figure out how to support them through all the different things we've been talking about. But what's also interesting, there's about 40% of employees who actually have been thriving in this sort of environment. And what we want to make sure that we're doing is not correcting for the 50% that have struggled at the expense of the 40% that have been thriving. Because frankly, there's some people that prefer to work from home, prefer to work how they've been working, have actually been doing better because of this. And what this means is that as we're looking at our workforce as a whole, there's not going to be one big set of solutions that works for everyone. That we're going to have to better understand to a much granular level of detail about what's going on with each of our employees. Because we don't want to go to someone who's been like, well, we know you've been struggling with all sorts of mental health challenges. It's been really hard. You've been really isolated, whatever. And then that person says, actually, I love it. Like that's, so we just have to be careful and thoughtful about broad brushing, because it is true for a large percentage of our workforce, a majority in a lot of cases, but not all. But what I think it speaks to the most is in some ways what our managers are going to have to do. Our managers are going to have to be able to understand what's going on with their employees, the people that happen to be working for them, to a much greater level of detail than they ever had before, and have that empathy to really understand what's going on with Tim, what's going on with Krystall, what's going on with Jenny, because each of those situations are going to be different. And that degree of intimate understanding that our managers are going to need to have about their employees is going to change our expectations of what managers do. It's going to change who should be a good manager. Because the other thing that's going on here when we step outside of the pandemic and hybrid environment is that there's a lot of historical manager activities that are getting automated away. So setting up schedules, expense report management, variety of stuff like that took a lot of time. So for managers, we're entering this period where a lot of their historical responsibilities are going away, and they're going to be having to take on a whole new set of responsibilities that are more about the social connections, the emotional connections, the empathy building that we're going to need that's different for each employee. And I think one of the big things that people leaders should be asking themselves is, how is our manager competency model or manager leader or leadership model, whatever you've got, how is that going to be different going forward than it's been for the last decade? Because it should look really different. And then that's going to create a corresponding set of questions, which is, who should our managers and leaders be? How do we create career paths for people that are highly skilled that don't want that anymore? And how do we build those new capabilities that we're going to need to have that are going to be empathy, more like a high school counselor, if you will, more a connector than it was a task manager, which largely is what our managerial models have been before. It's find somebody who knows how to do the job and can train other people to do the job. And technology, peers, other things are replacing that. And now it's find someone who can understand the unique challenges that each employee has and help them solve not just their skill challenges, but their emotional challenges, their social challenges, their family challenges, and provide that sort of support. Those are the people most of the time.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think the way that the work is shifting, right? You asked about practical tips for the leaders on finance. I think fundamentally we have to humanize, right? And I think there's this, shift. I mean, the word empathy, I think, is right on. But there's this shift. So, for example, in my team, I've got a 50-person team. We're global, right? This organizational analytics team, and we talk to our team members, right? We ask our team members to talk to their managers, to their teammates about how do they work best? How could they be best supported? What boundaries do they need, right? I've got 2 boys who are 8 and 4. And my lovely wife, and I start my workday at 7 a.m. for global calls. But I have a hard stop at 4:45 p.m. every day because I've got to go pick them up, right? And then I spend a few hours with them, off till bedtime, right? And then, I try to be fully present. I'm not on any devices, anything like that. And then after that, I'm back to work for 2 or 3 hours, right? And that's what fundamentally works for me, right? But doesn't work for necessarily everybody else. And so we meet each person where they are individually, right? And then we have those dialogues to say, look, it's fundamentally about getting results, right? You've got to be productive, you've got to be effective, but do it in the way that works for you, right? And it's about autonomy, it's about flexibility. So creating the conditions, creating that environment, right, as leaders for people to thrive, and then role modeling those behaviors, right? Demonstrating those behaviors, right? And I'm not expecting anybody, and I tell my team, like, I don't expect you to do what I do or to respond when I do. You do what works for you, right? And of course, the other aspect of this is asking for support so that we're not just living in our own, lane on the highway, right? But that we're intersecting, right? And we're, really collaborating in an effective way. And also that we're not insular, just ourselves, right? But, with the team, but also connecting to the broader company and to the broader ecosystem as well. So not missing those connections, which are critical.
We've got a question from our watchers. I don't know if that's the right term, but what do you think drove this need to sort of humanize ever more? And I think, let's say, the people experience, leadership management. What was the turning point is the question.
So if I can jump in here, so the pandemic obviously had a massive influence on this, right? But I think the reason that it did was we all had to come together at a very basic level, right? To say, this is about, fighting for health, fighting for survival, fighting for people as people, right? And having to come together on that front. And I think by and large, we've done that, within countries, and largely around the world. If we take this recent surge of COVID in India, nothing galvanized us more than the fact that we, shared kind of all these horrific experiences that we were going through. We had people who, got COVID, right? We had people that, were in the hospital, right? We had people that, family members, they lost loved ones, right? And if you've seen the videos of what's going on in India, I mean, it's unfathomable, right? And you strip away, it's not about work anymore. It's about people. It's about people as human beings. And so how we rallied around that, right? And of course, that was an extreme situation, or is still an extreme situation. But, we started using the language of family. We started using the language of really coming together, supporting each other. Now, that may be extreme, right, in our case, but this was an extreme situation. But I think that's what really is helping us shift to say, this is more about humanity. It's about treating people as human beings. And I think that's why this humanizing effect is taking place. And I really hope, and I also believe that I think this is going to be a shift for the good, for somewhat permanence, although it's going to take time, as Brian said, for us to get there.
There's another question. No, first, does anyone else want to tackle that, add to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to add two additional thoughts. One is when the Business Roundtable came out and said that companies have responsibility to all their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, I think that started companies to begin to think differently, not only about their employees, but about their communities. And that's taken a couple of years to bear fruit. But I think that, in addition to the pandemic, were things that were moving us in this direction forward. And then the other thing I'd point out is one of the other big shifts that started occurring before the pandemic and was accelerated in particular last summer is an expectation that employees have that their employers get actively involved in the societal and political and cultural debates of the day. Mm-hmm. What we see now is that about 75% of employees expect their employer to get involved in whatever those issues are. And in order to get involved in those issues, you have to have more than a rational transactional relationship. You have to have that more emotional relationship. So I think those are other things, in addition to everything we've learned during the pandemic and experienced during the pandemic, that are accelerating this move to a much more human relationship.
Yeah.
And I mean, just on a very tangible level, we all have had these Zoom calls where kids and cats and everyone sort of like walked through the sort of like screen. And I think it actually was a really good reminder that it's like humans with all facets and aspects in their lives we're working with. And I think that's maybe just a small tangible reminder that humanized the workplace a bit. And maybe one other thought on the previous question of really practical things that we can do and think of. And I think this is where we spoke a lot about intentionality in the early part of the conversation. I don't want to go back to it too much, but I think the other element of that is habits, right? And I think the question is how do we, on a very practical level, build out good organizational and individual habits. And I think this is actually something where technology can also sort of like be a really strong enabler. And what we've seen, for example, throughout our customer base is like the amount of companies that really intensified how they do pulse surveys throughout their workforce, because all of a sudden, beforehand, there might have been this feeling of we know what people think and feel and what the issues are, and all of a sudden, when you don't see them anymore, or not as holistically anymore, there was the realization, well, maybe we don't know what's going on, and sort of like using data to get a better understanding of the sentiment at sort of like a global level through the company, but maybe also the individual challenges, being able to follow up on that and act upon that, I think is something that we've seen become more present for people, teams, and leaders. And also sort of like using technology to actually leverage transparency, to give leadership sort of like tooling to make sure that you have those proper one-on-ones well prepared. Just sort of like using, I mean, I think technology is something agnostic and can be helpful or it can be hurtful, but using sort of like the helpful parts of technology to build these good organizational and individual habits that help us with that intentionality we need, something that we really have seen and that we also use internally to tackle things on a very practical level.
Jenny, I want to stay with you because, you know, in the hybrid world, offices are still going to play a role. And you highlighted that earlier on. What is the office? What does it become in this new world? And I'm curious, you know, what measures, what initiatives are you doing to help facilitate that return to work, to answer that question?
So we basically have, we decided, I think, in January, I think it was, so amidst the sort of third wave, to actually prepare for opening another office, and then also sort of like tackling that in a slightly different space, sort of like the layout. There's some sort of like quiet working area, there's phone booths, and there's sort of like a bit more what looks like a cafe, so like which can also be like played around with to facilitate workshops and one-on-ones and meetings. So sort of like the whole setup of that space is something that we believe will cater even better to sort of like how what could be valuable in our hybrid model. And then we also sort of like are thinking a lot more now about what exactly is the role of our office in terms of being predominantly a place that makes our culture tangible, that is a platform for people to meet each other, to build connectedness, to have the random conversations, probably a lot of the learning training formats. We do want to sort of like learning, training, creativity, innovation-oriented interactions. Probably is something what we want to use the office for as a platform. But I mean, we're in the very early days of the learning of what will work and which of our hypotheses might be completely wrong. But we're very firm on, we want the office to have a pull factor rather than sort of like, you know, there's rules on when you need to be in the office. So we're definitely also counting very strongly on autonomy there, but it's sort of like this maybe a bit of a trade-off between autonomy and connectedness that we're trying to bridge there. But we're also thinking about other formats. So team offsite, for example, like really bringing the team together for maybe 2 days in the countryside, to also have additional sort of like moments and events that generate connectedness and the basis for psychological safety and sort of like truly building authentic relationships, creating belonging. And I mean, frankly, we're really at the beginning of that learning journey.
I think I read some of the news that some companies are like offering rewards, offering, you know, gifts, gamifying this a little bit to come back to the office and you can have like a year's worth of free coffee or whatever it is. You know, Brian, what's your take on those kinds of strategies?
You know, the thing that employees are asking is, why is it going to be better for me to go to the office than to work from home? And the thing that's going to be the biggest difference for those employees is the social connections that they get from the office. And what we have to think differently here is that in the past, we had a very rational approach to it, which is you come to the office to do work because that's where, you know, historically the manufacturing equipment was, or the typewriter was, or the mainframe was that I had to log into, or what have you. As everything's gone to the cloud, as everyone has laptops now, who kind of knowledge workers who have that sort of thing, all of the rational things have largely gone away. And by the way, this next generation of HR tech will be dramatically better in terms of the video capabilities and interactive capabilities and collaborative capabilities for employees to work together. So almost all of the rational reasons as to why I would go to an office have largely gone away, which leaves us with emotional and social reasons. So I think what you have to be thinking about is, how do I design my office and my in-person experiences more broadly? Because to Jenny's point, they might occur in your building, they might occur in an offsite, they might occur somewhere else. But the thing that you should be asking yourself is, how do I design those experiences intentionally to drive emotional and social connections amongst people, not just between the manager and the employee? And the reason why is that when it comes to driving retention, what you want to build in a world that where employees are going to have a lot more choice as location becomes less of a constraint over what jobs people have, we're going to be moving into a world where employees are going to be saying, well, why should I keep working here when I've got more opportunities that are available to me? And frankly, it's relatively easy to quit a company. It's relatively easy to quit a manager, but it's pretty hard to quit your friends. And if your friends and those social connections are at where you work and you've built them and designed them and created an environment where that occurs, you're going to be benefited by improved retention coming out of that. So I think the real question is, as we think about our workspace, is how do we design it to get the right culture? To Jenny's point, how do we design it in a way that builds those social connections? But that's what we should be asking. It's like, why is it cool to hang out at our place of work? Like that's the mindset and the frame we have to go in. It's like, why is this so cool? Why is this a place where people want to come and do work when their home option, gosh, is pretty darn good? We got to win that fight if we want people back in our workplaces.
And I'm mindful that, of course, as you mentioned, knowledge workers, quote unquote, white collar roles becomes very present. And then, I think, Tim, you had mentioned this in our prep. I mean, don't forget, we do have, industry where there's a shop floor. And I'm curious what your view is. Can those industries, can those companies ignore what's going on here? Because will they have to come back to the conveyor belt?
Yeah, I think, there are definite differences by industry. I think there's also differences by function and by role. And we've seen in the pandemic, certain, industries got walloped, right? I mean, immediately, in the ones we expected, like retail, for example. I do think it's easier to do a remote hybrid, for white collar workforces, right? And jobs, the corporate jobs, the office jobs. But we've actually found, and we just did some recent analysis actually that I saw yesterday, right? And we found that, we're looking at some supply chain roles. We found that, 37% of those, the tasks within those jobs could be done remote, right? Which to me was, might not sound like much, but in that space, it's actually huge, right? So there is an opportunity, right, to shift the way that work is going in, blue collar workforces, field workforces, with retail workers. And I think augmentation and automation, right, are really going to help, to kind of seal that deal and help make those changes happen. So I do see those kinds of changes afoot. I don't see them to be as big, certainly, as what we'd see in the sort of white collar work, workspace and functions.
There's some ways that companies, though, are starting to think about those ideas applied to different places. So, for example, there's a grocery retailer that we work with. And what they have shifted is, rather than you work for a particular store, you work for a particular district. And so when you're deciding your schedule, you can work for any of the different stores within the district. So yes, you still have to go to a location and you can't work from home. But by giving you choice over which store you go to, you get more flexibility over time. So there's lots of jobs where you can't do them from home. And even think like scientist, doctor, nurse, those you can't do it. So what companies are going to have to do is think about what are other ways that we can create flexibility in their experience if we can't create flexibility in their location. And one of the other reasons why that's really important is one of the other major themes that has come up because of COVID and where we've been going is this question of equity and fairness. And we're in a very K-shaped world where there's some people that financially have thrived during the pandemic, other people that have really struggled. There's some countries that are turning the corner on the virus and others that are really struggling still. But one of the things that we've seen more and more is a split between the haves and have-nots. And if we're not thinking about how do we create similar types of support for employees that are blue collar compared to white collar and so on, is that it's going to start to generate all these questions about fairness and equity in our organizations. And if we're not having an organization that's both fair and perceived as fair, that's one of the dark sides that you mentioned potentially of a hybrid world, is that this question between some people get benefits and some people don't. Is that okay? Is that not okay? How do we communicate about that? Do we give other support to our workers, our deskless workers? Like, how do we think through that? And these questions of fairness will be huge going forward as well.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, and I know there's two questions I want to try and sneak in our last 10 minutes. One from someone who's watching us, and the other one is shifting a little bit with the world of hybrid opening up, the opportunity to tap into the talent markets obviously changed. We touched on that a little bit when we talked about going into sort of being more inclusive in the way we think about talent. You have the debates going on about comp. What do you do if people no longer want to come to the office, and how do you handle comp? Is it, the market becomes all even, doesn't matter where someone's based. We start to factor cost of living into that. Just open wide question. Any advice, thoughts for people leaders as we think about talent acquisition in a world where there's so much more flexibility?
I'll jump in. So it's interesting. We have a client right now who's probably one of the most progressive on this front, and they've launched last August actually a move to a completely distributed workforce, right? Virtual workforce, right? And they basically told their employees, you can work from anywhere in the world that you want, anytime. Again, it's all about getting results. And so they had all kinds of different popular destinations that people started to land in, some people just moved up 50 miles away, 100 miles away, right from where they were. Some people moved to different countries, but it creates it creates a new set of problems, right? And so from a compensation perspective, they said, well, actually, you're working in this location, and that location has the cost of living is 25% less or 50% less than where you were living before. We have to make an adjustment based on that. And there was all kinds of backlash. And I think it was more about how that was handled and the expectation, right? It was about, you're getting flexibility, but it wasn't communicated beforehand to say, well, actually your compensation is going to shift as a result of that, right? So I think if you're upfront about those changes, upfront about those shifts, there's that high level of transparency, you can have the right kind of dialogue, right? So it's more expectation setting up front. But if you just kind of go willy-nilly and you kind of fight the fires as they come up, oh, wait a minute, we have to rethink compensation now. Oh, there's tax and there's compensatory issues because of people working all around the world. You're doing it as an afterthought, and it's going to become very reactive, and you're going to run into these kinds of backlashes and problems. So I think that word intentional has become the theme of this conversation, as Jenny is so wonderfully said, right? And I think it's exactly that. You've got to be intentional and forthright about these things up front.
Brian, Jenny, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Jenny, go ahead. Yeah. What we're seeing just from the comp question, what most companies are doing is they don't want to cut comp because that is problematic for all sorts of reasons for employees that have moved. But what they are saying is we're going to dramatically slow the rate of comp increase if you've moved. So, making the numbers up here, if that, in the past, a meets meant a 2.5% raise. If you get a meets this year, we're only going to give you a 1% raise, or maybe no raise from that perspective, because you've chosen to move to a lower cost of living location until it evens out. But again, this kind of gets to the philosophy question, right? Like, a policy can be, here's exactly how we're going to manage pay from this perspective. Yeah. But the philosophy is, are we going to adjust pay based upon where people live, or are we going to have a pay strategy which is all based on your contribution, no matter where you live? Again, either approach can work, but having that philosophical viewpoint as to what you stand for as a company is a perfect example of making that clear, because by communicating that philosophy, then employees know, well, I have the choice over where I live, but that comes with pay implications. Or I have the choice over where I live, and it doesn't come with pay implications. And that, like getting squared away on what your philosophical belief is there, that will help prevent kind of the foxhole by foxhole fighting around each individual pay decision that plays out. But most are simply saying, yeah, you can live wherever you've moved to, but rate of comp increase is going to slow. And part of that is that we're going to such a tight talent market that most companies don't have the luxury of just saying, okay, we've decided to move by, we're done. That's just not a realistic talent strategy given the tightness of the labor market, in particular for people that have got critical in-demand skills that aren't there.
Indeed. Now we've got 5 minutes left, so and I don't want to. I think Jenny, you were going to add to it, but I'm going to fold it into the last question, if I may, which was from one of our someone watching. I think it's good. Sounds like chaos is going to be part of the new normal, referencing the earlier train wreck and the transition. And so the question is, how can we best manage this chaos, which incorporates the comp question? So Jenny, I'm going to start with you if you want to sort of respond to that in our final 5 minutes.
I mean, I think to some extent we even actually had that. I mean, we didn't call it chaos, but we had that question of what ultimately it means if we go sort of like optimizing as a philosophy for very personal needs in a hybrid setup. And I think the reality, yes, it is definitely going to be more complex than before, because there's different needs and different needs needing sort of like different solutions. I think it's just, I mean, frankly, I think with decentral ownership and individual ownership and autonomy, every employee with their own needs is part of sort of like also bringing up the solutions. That would be sort of like my psychological approach to that, or philosophical approach to that. So I have probably believe that that together we can always find solutions to that, but it's going to be hyper personalized to some extent, and it is going to be more, I would call it complex than chaotic, but I think we'll actually not, we don't want to get around it, I would even say.
I would add, I think there's, oh, sorry, Jenny, please keep going.
I'm done.
No, please finish your thought.
No, I was done.
Okay, all right. I agree with Jenny, and I think I wouldn't call it just chaos. I think it's controlled chaos is what we're moving more towards. And just a story to kind of share that, to kind of illustrate that. So we have a client right now, they did the dramatic shift to remote work due to the pandemic. They were a very command and control kind of environment beforehand. And, they started to see really high levels of productivity in their people when they went remote, fully remote. But then, the dark side came in, as you were talking about before, Krystall, and major levels of burnout also started to happen. And in fact, the head of this particular organization lost 2 of his direct reports, completely blindsided, because they made the shift to remote. They were giving all the signs that, hey, we're burned out, we need to slow down here. It's kind of ignored, and then they left, right? And, they lost really great talent in the process. And so the leader had an epiphany and said, look, we've got to fundamentally shift this, right? If we're completely blindsided by this just for 2 people, how are these other thousands of people, in my organization, handling this? And so they set out with a sort of an employee empowerment program, right, to shift people from being overwhelmed to really being able to thrive. And they, set up the conditions for people to do so. They it effectively turned into a culture transformation, right, where people were able to get flexibility and sort of the white space to innovate and think and all that kind of good stuff. And that fundamental shift, they introduced like all these different products and a hub for people basically to look at different work practices. So how they could practically, if they needed to get certain extra time in their day, maybe I need to start my meetings 5 minutes late, right? All meetings starting at 05, right? Or, 5 minutes past the time. Just to have that a little bit of extra time, take a deep breath, run to the loo, get yourself a cup of coffee, whatever you need to do for yourself, stand up, stretch, whatever it is, right? all those kinds of little practices, right? Those habits Jenny was talking about that really make a big difference, or those micro habits that really make a big difference. And they've seen massive shifts in employee engagement. They've seen massive shifts in retention. Brian was talking earlier about the loss of jobs, women in the workplace. Estimated 5.4 million women lost their jobs just in the U.S. alone, right? In the pandemic, and we're seeing some slowdown, but it's still quite high. Now we're seeing, cases where, like an example in this client, there's a single working mom who thought, she was at her wit's end, couldn't get proper childcare. Her child was at home with her while she's trying to do her work, and felt completely overwhelmed. And through this program, she was able to see that she was in control. She was empowered. She had the authority and the flexibility to do whatever she needed to do to make things work for her, to the point that she actually, shifted the way that she was working, expanded, and she said, look, I can actually take on more now, than what she originally thought, versus thinking I have to leave the workforce because I can't handle this. This is it's unsustainable. Yeah. So I think that's really the power at a macro level and a micro level of these kinds of changes if we get them right. And so I do think it's controlled chaos and the ability to really manage through that.
Great. Listen, thank you for that. I think we're out of time. I just want to quickly sort of summarize themes as a people leader listening to all of you. Intentionality, clearly. Customization, as we want to be more personalized for people. And I think that implies philosophy, structure, let's say. And if you have that philosophy and structure, that should minimize the foxhole, or the firefighting that can come through with such chaos. I think that's how, as a people leader, I would sort of summarize takeaways. Thank you, Brian, Jenny, Timothy, for joining me today. I think we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to end it there. But thank you so much for really educating me.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.